This week, our focus is on immigration to the United States in the 1800s and how it has shaped the country and society we live in today. While anyone living in the United States can trace their history back to an immigrant, other than the indigenous people who were here when the explorers first arrived, white people, especially British colonists, saw this country as theirs, putting white people above everybody else. This video addresses the way that the xenophobia that existed in the colonies has shaped the country we live in today through the experiences of Irish, Chinese, and Japanese immigrants. There are some terms that are used in relation to discrimination and oppression against immigrants that are still used today. I'm going to go over them now to define the terms on their own, separate from how they impacted different immigrant groups and their experiences in the U.S. over time. Put simply, ethnocentrism is the belief that your culture is better than anyone else's culture. From very early on in this country, WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, have been very ethnocentric. Each of those things combined to create the core privileged identity in the U.S. since before the country existed. During the time the colonies existed separately, and mostly as British subjects, if you weren't a WASP, you faced discrimination that was fueled by ethnocentrism. Xenophobia also fueled those early acts of discrimination and oppression. Xenophobia, quote, literally means fear and hatred of foreigners, end quote. Xenophobia is one of the ideologies that has been around since the colonies were being established and has continued on today. As Erica Lee puts it, xenophobia, quote, promotes an irrational fear and hatred of immigrants and demonizes foreigners, and, crucially, people considered to be foreign, end quote. Xenophobia creates a narrow definition of who is and is not American, framing immigration as an invasion of hostile populations. Xenophobia has also been used against the indigenous people of this continent, as well as African people who were enslaved and brought to this country. Nationalism, according to Benedict Anderson in his book Imagined Communities, is another cultural construction. The borders that define where a nation exists within are imaginary lines that countries have agreed upon. Even the borders of a city or a state are imagined. They exist on paper, but they do not exist physically in the world. We create places and markers to say where one nation or community begins and ends. But from that establishment of imaginary boundaries comes the ideology of nationalism that says one's nation is better than every other nation. Nationalism takes pride and loyalty in one's nation to the extreme, elevating membership in that nation above everyone else's. This differs from ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is about an ethnicity being better, like British people. But you don't have to be white to be nationalist. Black, Latina, Asian, and Swana people can all be nationalist and say that the U.S. is better than any other nation. Assimilation is another term that comes up when discussing immigration. Assimilation is the belief that any racial or ethnic group can become part of the dominant group. In the U.S., that means trying to be white. One example is in how someone talks. Having an accent that indicates that English is not your first language, whether that accent is Mexican, Puerto Rican, Chinese, Japanese, German, Russian, Kenyan, South African, Indian, or Tunisian, is something that you should work to get rid of if you want to assimilate into U.S. culture. Speaking English and nothing else is also a goal of assimilationists. Eating foods that are American and not from one's home or ancestral culture is another aspect of assimilation. And these are just a few examples, but they are common examples of assimilationist ideology. In the 1800s, there was an influx of undesirable European populations. At first it was predominantly the Irish, but it also included Poles, Italians, Greeks, Russians, Slavs, Jews, and more Germans. The government and those in power were trying to keep the U.S. white by keeping the non-white populations from increasing too much at any given time. The irony of this action is that while white was the dominant racial category in the U.S. up to the 1950s, it was far from a white country. This all-encompassing, flattening definition of white in the U.S. that we use today came about after World War II. Even through the war, many groups that are now considered white were not. This is a big part of why there remains ethnic pride among people who have these backgrounds. Being white is still relatively new. Since the 1950s, there has been a gradual decrease in this thinking, but it is far from gone. In response to this increase in undesirable immigrants, xenophobia flared up again, inspiring the creation of a secret society known as the Know-Nothings, because when asked about being a part of the group, members would respond that they know nothing. By the mid-1800s, they had spread across the country and gained enough members and support that they were able to influence legislation and even formed their own political party. Officially called the American Party, it was known as the Know Nothing Party. On the East Coast, their focus was the influx of Irish immigrants, especially in Massachusetts. The Irish faced discrimination that other white populations didn't. The Irish were subjected to discrimination in their own lands thanks to the British Empire. Many Irish immigrated to the U.S. to escape oppression in their homeland, seeing the U.S. as a better option. One of the reasons the U.S. was a better option was the land was not contaminated by potato blight. The potato famine drove people out of Ireland because the choice was leave or starve. When the Irish arrived in the U.S., they found themselves still facing discrimination and oppression. But many felt it was a better option than being back in Ireland. So they stayed. Ireland was increasingly owned by the British, leaving little for the Irish to live on without paying to live there. There were also food shortages across the board, with most of the food produced being exported to England. In the U.S., there was food and jobs to be had, and the possibility of owning land. Part of why the Irish were treated differently than other white immigrants is because most of them were Catholic. There were Catholic immigrants before, but not to the same degree that Irish immigration brought. The anti-Catholic xenophobia has its roots in the fact that most colonies were British, and all were Protestant. The head of the Catholic Church is and has always been the Pope. This foreign allegiance led people to think that Catholics were trying to take over the country for the Pope. And yes, they were ignoring the fact that the colonies were formed by people coming over and remaining loyal to the British Crown, taking the land away from indigenous tribes who were already here. Xenophobia doesn't have to make sense. It just is. The Irish took up jobs that, until then, were done by blacks and Mexicans. They worked as household servants, in mines, in fields, and on the railroads, and they were treated like blacks and Mexicans. They were seen as less than compared to the whites in power, despite often having whiter skin than those in power, and thus weren't considered white. Part of that discrimination was because Irish immigrants were Catholic. And as we saw with German Catholic immigration, xenophobia rears its ugly head and immediately others the Irish, despite being white. Those fears of Catholic immigrants coming over to take over the country and turn it Catholic was still going strong after German immigration. The fact that Irish immigration was overwhelmingly Catholic just stoked the fire. People really did think that these immigrants were working for or so devoted to the Pope that they would listen to him over the U.S. government. Which was not the case, and there was never an example of this. But that didn't stop that xenophobic thinking. I find it interesting that there was such worry over Catholics taking over the U.S. when the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, among other important things. It means there is no official religion of the U.S., especially one recognized by the government. It also means it's illegal to prohibit someone from practicing their religion. The concern over another religion taking over, I feel, goes back to the fact that most colonists were British and thus Protestant. Let's face it, the Anglican Church was founded because Henry VIII wanted to divorce his first wife, and the Pope wouldn't let him. So he created the Anglican Church and put himself in charge. It's still that way today. The ruling monarch of Great Britain, currently King Charles III, is also the head of the Anglican Church. While it was common for the Irish to find their way into police departments across the country, that was usually about as far up the class ladder that they were allowed to climb. Most Irish were limited to doing jobs that involved doing hard labor and long hours for low pay, despite the physical and mental toll it took on them. That is until Chinese immigration ramped up and started to be forcefully opposed by those in power. Suddenly, the Irish were white, and the fact that they were Catholic didn't matter as much compared to the evils that the Chinese brought with them. Who knows what would have happened if the people who were already on this continent in the 1800s, the indigenous, enslaved and free blacks, and Mexican people, were the only ones for those in power to exploit. We'll never know because that's when Chinese immigration began. The Chinese were the first population to engage in large-scale immigration to the U.S. that weren't white. As you read in Searching for Gold Mountain, the initial wave of immigrants had little interest in staying there. It was an employment opportunity. Most Chinese came to the U.S. in search of a way to make money they could send back to their families and eventually go back to rejoin them, at least at first. For some, staying here became the better option, especially those who married and had children here. For some, the abuse they were subject to at the hands of Americans and the police made going back not an option. At first, Chinese labor was seen as a better option than black or Mexican labor because the Chinese were hardworking and not lazy, like the others had become. I say become because blacks and Mexicans were still doing harsh labor despite how whites were characterizing them. It seems to me that every time a new group is encountered, they're a great source of labor to exploit until a new group that isn't white is encountered. Yet, despite this exploitation, the money they would make on the railroad or searching for gold was more than what they would or could make at home, so they endured. Even being exploited, they would be praised by their white superiors for working so hard, especially on the railroads. They may not be part of official photos or newspaper articles about the Transcontinental Railroad, but the half that started on the West Coast wouldn't have been finished if not for Chinese labor. While some Chinese men went to work in hard labor, others were entrepreneurs and established their own businesses. They opened stores, restaurants, and laundries. They looked around to see what businesses weren't around and filled in the gaps themselves. But even then, they weren't necessarily treated any better than those who worked for others outside of the Chinese community, especially the men who did women's work of cooking and cleaning. It's a big part of why there are Chinatowns across the country, especially along the West Coast. Chinatowns started simply as where Chinese immigrants lived and started businesses because it's where they were allowed to live and own property. The Know-Nothing Party had declined in power for a while, but it didn't go away. With the increase in Chinese immigration, there was a resurgence of the party, especially along the West Coast. Know-Nothing members could often be found leading the charge against Chinese immigration and establishing anti-Chinese groups and unions to further support and spread anti-Chinese sentiment and legislation at the local, state, and national levels of government. While Chinese immigrants settled all along the West Coast, including in Canada and Mexico, many were located in California, and California took legal measures to discourage that population increasing in a few ways. One example is the Pigtail Ordinance in 1873. In San Francisco, which had a very large Chinese population, if you were male and arrested, you had to have your hair cut to 1 inch in length. This meant many Chinese had their queue, the long braid down their back, shaved off. For those with the queues, this was a cultural expression, and in shaving them off made it hard or impossible for them to return to China without their queue because it would signal being part of a different cultural group. This ordinance was rarely enforced with populations other than the Chinese. Originally, the mayor vetoed the law, citing that it targeted Chinese immigrants. 3 years later, other legislation was passed that created an opportunity to try to pass the ordinance again, and it passed and was enacted. The Pigtail Ordinance was in place until it was ruled unconstitutional in 1879 by a federal court judge. Other legislation that was passed along the West Coast included laws that governed how much space there needed to be per person in a residence, restricting where Chinese and Chinese Americans could work or run businesses, and what materials a building needed to be made from in order to run a business there. These laws were aimed at Chinese and Chinese Americans to force them to leave the city or the state and return to China. And when those didn't work, mobs would chase them out of the city, burning their homes and businesses. As Takaki put it on page 188, the Chinese were, quote, described as heathen, morally inferior, savage, childlike, and lustful. Chinese women were condemned as a depraved class, their immorality associated with a physical appearance, quote, but a slight removal from the African race, end quote, and end quote. And like blacks, Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans were restricted as to how they could live their lives. They couldn't marry anyone not Chinese, they were limited as to where they could live. Eventually, as you read in Article 19 of the California Constitution in 1876, continued immigration was reduced to as close to nothing as possible, including the intentional importation of Chinese to exploit as a labor force. But while the article did do that little bit of good, it mostly continued to oppress the rights of Chinese in California. It also continued to encourage the hate and oppression Asians faced in the U.S. at that time and ever since. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was made federal law, preventing laborers from China to immigrate to the U.S. in general for 10 years. If you were a merchant, teacher, student, traveler, or diplomat, you were allowed to enter. Even then, exceptions were made for certain people to enter the United States. Like Chinese immigrants before them, Japanese immigrants came to largely settle along the west coast of the United States and in the territory of Hawaii. On Hawaii, they were still immigrants, and it took some time for those living there, both white and Hawaiian, to somewhat accept these new additions to the population. Many were farmers, fleeing taxes that left them without land and thus without the ability to feed their families. Word reached Japan that working on a plantation in the Kingdom of Hawaii, one could earn 6 times more than they could in Japan. The Japanese government even supported the emigration, announcing that it would send 600 to Hawaii. 28,000 applied. Between 1885 and 1924, 200,000 Japanese immigrated to Hawaii, while another 180,000 immigrated to the U.S. In Hawaii, laborers were welcome, men and women alike. The Hawaiian government actually required that women be part of the immigrant labor force. Japanese laborers, regardless of gender, were welcome in the many fields across the Hawaiian Islands. Companies that had established sugar plantations were eager for labor and worked with Japan so those who wanted to could make their way to Hawaii for work. When it came to immigrating to the U.S., the Japanese government negotiated with the U.S. government to allow Japanese immigrants who weren't simply laborers to bring their wives with them, something the Chinese were expressly prohibited from doing. Initially, those who immigrated to the U.S. were businessmen, looking to make money without working in the fields all day long. Of course, when the U.S. overthrew the Hawaiian Kingdom and claimed it as a territory of the U.S., the immigration limitations applied. But soon Japanese farmers found success and work on the mainland in addition to Hawaii. Yet, no matter where they worked, Japanese immigrants and their children also faced discrimination. They would frequently strike to protest their working and living conditions, which were harsh and minimal. They were limited to unskilled labor positions on plantations because only Americans and those eligible for citizenship could take skilled positions. And while they were not Chinese, they were Asian, which meant they were not eligible for U.S. citizenship. After a while, the workers in Hawaii worked with native workers to form labor unions to represent all of them and not be divided by race. When farmers were allowed to come to the West Coast, they faced the same kinds of discrimination other Asian immigrants had faced. But they brought a skill set with them that the others could not. They came from generations of farmers who had to work small plots of land that required a lot of irrigation and work to be productive. Using the techniques handed down to them through the generations, they were able to take pieces of land that American and even Mexican farmers could not make productive into profitable farms. It also helped that the expansion of the U.S. and its population meant a rise in the demand for food. Once people saw what Japanese farmers were capable of, people were more willing to allow farmers to enter into contracts, shares, leases, and even sell them land. Because of their ability to turn a profit quickly, they were able to quickly clear any debts and become landowners, saving them even more money. While Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans did face discrimination and racism, it came more from everyday interactions with whites than through local, state, and government actions. That is, until December 7th, 1941, but that's for a later time.